There is this incredibly universal experience. It's like it's 5 a.m. on a Tuesday. It's pitch black outside. The room is freezing cold and your alarm just went off and you're just lying there staring at the ceiling and your hand is hovering right over the snooze button.
Oh, yeah. It's the ultimate moment of truth, really.
Right. And in that moment, what are we all doing? We are waiting. We're lying there waiting for this magical lightning bolt surge of motivation to hit us.
Exactly.
We think, if I just lie here for 2 more minutes, I'll feel inspired to go to the gym or work on that novel or, tackle that massive project at work. But that feeling, it almost never comes.
It rarely does.
Yeah.
And yet, we build our entire approach to achieving our goals around the assumption that it will, which is wild when you think about it.
It really is. Which is why, for today's deep dive, we are completely rethinking how we get things done. So welcome to you, the learner. Today, we're tearing down the myth of motivation.
Yeah, we really are. We're going to explore the hard science of discipline, habit formation, and environmental design. And to do this, we've pulled from a really fascinating stack of sources. We've got neurobiological research on dopamine, behavioral economic studies from Deloitte and Tutor to You, organizational change management case studies from Procy, and insights from James Clear's Atomic Habits.
Plus some really interesting daily routines of elite performers like Jerry Seinfeld and Twyla Tharp.
Right.
And it's a remarkable collection of data because it all converges on this one undeniable truth. Relying on your willpower is a biological trap.
A trap. So our mission today is to help you escape that trap. We're going to uncover why motivation is so fleeting and how you can actually engineer your brain, your environment, and even your workplace for guaranteed success.
Sounds like a solid mission.
But to understand why we shouldn't rely on motivation, we first have to look at what it actually is on a biological level. And I know the sources start this whole exploration with, a rather intense study about rats. Yeah, it's a slightly disturbing but incredibly groundbreaking 1954 study by researchers James Olds and Peter Milner.
Okay.
They basically implanted a tiny electrode into the brain of a rat, targeting what they thought was the pleasure center, and they wired it to a lever in the cage. So every time the rat pressed the lever, it got a tiny electrical stimulation.
And the rat just kept pressing it, right?
Relentlessly.
Yeah.
Up to 7,000 times an hour.
Wow.
The rats refused to eat. They refused to sleep. They would literally starve to death in a cage completely full of food.
Yes.
Just to keep pressing that lever until they collapsed from exhaustion.
That's insane.
Yeah. And for decades after that, scientists thought they had found the brain's ultimate pleasure circuit. They just assumed dopamine was the chemical of joy.
Which, that makes intuitive sense. If an animal is willing to starve to get a hit of something, it must feel amazing.
Right, it does make sense. Until a later discovery by a neuroscientist named Kent Berridge completely dismantled that myth.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he took rats and entirely depleted their dopamine. And what he found was just astonishing. If he put sugar water in their mouths, they still showed all the physical signs of enjoying it. They still experienced pleasure, but they wouldn't walk across the cage to get it.
Oh, wow. So they liked the sugar water, but they didn't actually want it enough to move.
Exactly. That is the crucial distinction. Dopamine isn't the pleasure chemical. It is the wanting chemical. It's the biological signal that tells your brain, that thing over there is worth the effort.
So then motivation is essentially a biological math problem that your brain is trying to solve in real time.
Yes, roughly 10,000 times a day. And the equation basically looks like motivation equals the expected reward value multiplied by the probability of success, all divided by the expected effort cost.
That explains so much about how we operate, and different parts of the brain are running different parts of that equation, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens are signaling the reward. They're looking at a donut in the break room and saying, that is going to be amazing.
Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex is calculating the probability. It's asking, what are the odds I actually get the donut if I get up and walk over there?
Spot on. And finally, your anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC, is tracking the effort cost. It's like the accountant in your head saying, is it really worth getting off this comfortable couch to walk all the way to the kitchen?
This totally explains the messy middle of any big project, because when you start something new, it feels electric, you have all this energy, but then you inevitably stall halfway through.
Yep.
The work hasn't gotten harder, but your brain just stops funding it with the wanting chemical.
Well, dopamine is highly responsive to what neuroscientists call prediction errors. Basically, surprises.
Surprises.
Right, when you start a new project, everything is novel.
Hmm.
Your brain is constantly surprised by small wins, which triggers a flood of dopamine.
Right.
But once a project becomes predictable, the prediction error drops to zero.
Ah, I
You
see.
know exactly what the work entails, there's no more surprise, and the dopamine just flatlines.
And the sources also point out 5 massive, like, motivation killers that can absolutely wreck this biological equation.
Oh yeah, sleep deprivation is a huge one.
Right, which literally blunts your dopamine receptors. You might still produce the chemical, but your brain can't receive the signal. So pulling an all-nighter basically guarantees you won't care about your goals the next day.
Yeah, and chronic stress does something really similar. High levels of cortisol suppress dopamine release, and then you have digital overstimulation.
Oh, phones.
Yep. Every time we scroll social media, we get these tiny, unpredictable dopamine hits that raise our baseline threshold. So suddenly, reading a book or working on a spreadsheet just can't compete with the algorithm.
The fourth one they mention is learned helplessness. Like, if you repeatedly fail at something, your prefrontal cortex drives the probability of success variable in our equation down to zero. And, anything multiplied by zero is zero.
Exactly. And finally, there's systemic inflammation. When your body is fighting off a chronic illness or dealing with a poor diet, that inflammation actually impairs your ability to synthesize dopamine in the first place.
Wow. So, thinking about all this biology, motivation reminds me of a spark plug in a car engine.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, it is fantastic for starting the engine. You absolutely need it to get the combustion going. But it's a terrible mechanism for keeping the car running on a long road trip across the country.
No, definitely not.
You can't just keep turning the ignition key over and over expecting to drive 500 miles. And
Yeah.
here's where it gets really interesting.
If our biology ensures that motivation will inevitably fizzle out as soon as a task becomes predictable, we have to find a different fuel source to keep the car running.
Right.
We have to migrate the workload from conscious willpower to automated discipline.
Which means confronting the idea that willpower is kind of a myth, or at least vastly misunderstood by most of us.
Yeah, for a long time, psychology relied heavily on Roy Baumeister's ego depletion theory. The idea was that willpower was like a finite muscle.
Oh, I've heard this. Like if you resist cookies all day.
Exactly. If you spent all day resisting chocolate chip cookies, your willpower muscle would get tired and you'd give up faster on a difficult puzzle later that evening.
But the sources note that this theory is failing replication left and right in modern psychological studies.
It really is. It turns out depletion is often just a signal of shifting priorities, not an empty fuel tank. What really exhausts us is decision fatigue and ambivalence. The constant internal negotiation of, should I do this or not?
So where does true discipline come from then?
True discipline happens when a behavior migrates neurologically. It moves from the prefrontal cortex, which is the high-energy decision-making hub of the brain, down into the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia, which is the brain's autopilot for procedural memory.
Exactly.
It's like how you can drive all the way to work and suddenly realize you don't remember the last 4 traffic lights.
Yes. That's the basal ganglia at work.
This ties heavily into James Clear's work in Atomic Habits. The goal is to build habits so ingrained they don't require conscious thought. He outlines the 4 laws of behavior change, which are make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying.
But the deepest level of his framework is actually about identity. Clear points out 3 layers of change: outcomes, processes, and identity.
Most people focus on the outcome, don't they?
They do. They say, I'm trying to write a book. But true behavioral automation happens when you shift to the identity layer and say, I am a writer.
I love that. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. And you see this in elite performers, like look at Jerry Seinfeld.
Oh, his calendar method.
Yes. His famous productivity strategy had nothing to do with writing good jokes. He got a big wall calendar and a red marker, and every day he wrote, he put a red X over that day. His only goal was simply, don't break the chain.
It's brilliant.
Or Twyla Tharp, the legendary choreographer. Her daily 5:30 a.m. workout routine isn't about the gym. The entire ritual is just focused on putting on her clothes and hailing the taxi.
Right, because once she's in the cab, the decision is made. She completely eliminates the cognitive peril of chickening out.
Okay, but I have to admit, I tried the Seinfeld calendar method once.
Oh, really? How did it go?
I lost my red marker on day 3 and my entire system collapsed.
Oh, no.
Which I guess proves the point about friction, but it also makes me wonder, let's unpack this. If I'm using a habit tracker like Seinfeld, aren't I just relying on motivation again? Like, I need the motivation to actually go over and mark the X on the calendar.
That's a great question. But it assumes the psychological weight of gaining an X is the same as losing a streak. And that misses a major quirk of human psychology called loss aversion.
Loss aversion.
Yeah, we feel the pain of a loss twice as intensely as the joy of a gain. In the beginning, sure, it takes a tiny bit of motivation to mark the first few X's, but once that chain gets long, it becomes an asset.
Oh, I see.
The psychological pain of breaking a 2-month streak overrides the effort cost of just sitting down to write for 5 minutes.
That makes the 2-minute rule that James Clear talks about so powerful. If you just commit to reading 1 page of a book or putting on your running shoes, you drop the activation energy so low that it bypasses the brain's effort discounting alarm entirely.
Precisely, because you're standardizing the behavior before you optimize it. Once the shoes are on, the brain's alarm bells turn off.
So if the brain is this wired to avoid effort, we shouldn't fight it. We should actually use that laziness to our advantage by changing the physical world around us. We have to design our environments to make the right choices automatic.
Which brings us to behavioral economics, specifically this concept of choice architecture. The term was popularized by Richard Thaler in his book Nudge, and is highlighted heavily in the Tutor 2U resources. Choice architecture is basically designing the decision environment to go with the grain of human psychology, rather than fighting against it.
The power of defaults is the classic example here, right?
Well, absolutely.
Because if you look at organ donation rates, in countries where you have to opt in, meaning you physically check a box on a form to become a donor, the rate is around 15%.
Yeah.
But in countries with an opt-out policy where you are automatically a donor unless you check a box to leave the program, the participation rate is over 90%.
It's a staggering difference.
Yeah.
And the same mechanism applies to retirement savings. Automatically enrolling employees into a 401k massively bumps participation compared to handing them a blank form and asking them to navigate the paperwork.
Because human inertia just keeps people in whatever the default state happens to be. It's all about friction. If you want to eat healthier, you decrease the friction for good habits by putting apples right at eye level on the kitchen counter. And you increase the friction for bad ones by charging your phone in the kitchen overnight so you physically cannot scroll in bed.
That's a great practical example.
It's like bowling with the bumper rails up. You don't have to be a perfect bowler or have perfect willpower if your environment physically prevents you from throwing a gutter ball.
That's exactly it. And we also have to consider framing. How information is presented changes our choices, even when the underlying facts are completely identical.
Really? Like how?
Well, think about describing a medical procedure as having a 90% survival rate. That gets a completely different emotional and behavioral response than saying it has a 10% mortality rate.
Wow. Yeah, that feels entirely different. So what does this all mean for the listener? The key for the individual is to stop trying to out-willpower the environment and just change the environment. But taking this from the individual to the group level is where things get really complex. How does a company use these behavioral systems?
That's where the Deloitte insights on HR come in. They reveal how deeply flawed human intuition really is when managing people. We rely entirely too much on our gut feeling.
Oh, definitely.
Daniel Kahneman describes this as our fast thinking. It's our brain's tendency to jump to quick, intuitive conclusions based on mental shortcuts.
Kahneman's Linda problem is such a perfect illustration of this.
Yes, it is.
You tell someone a story about Linda. She's 24, single, outspoken, brilliant, a philosophy major, and deeply concerned with social justice. Then you ask them, which is more likely? Option A, Linda is a bank teller, or option B, Linda is a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement. Most people instinctively choose option B.
Which is statistically impossible. The set of feminist bank tellers is just a smaller subset of all bank tellers. Option A encompasses option B. But our brains prioritize a coherent narrative over statistical logic.
The story of her being a feminist feels more aligned with the character description, so our fast thinking just completely overrides our mathematical reasoning.
Exactly. And that flawed, fast thinking plays out in real-world environments in devastating ways.
Yeah, the sources mention a study of judges making parole decisions. You would hope that the justice system is based purely on the facts of the case. But the data showed that first thing in the morning, judges granted parole about 60% of the time.
And what happened right before their lunch break?
That rate dropped to 0%.
Zero. Because decision fatigue literally dictated people's freedom. The judges were tired and hungry. Their prefrontal cortex was exhausted from making high-stakes decisions all morning, so their brains defaulted to the safest, lowest-effort option, denying parole.
That is terrifying.
It is. Gut feeling in HR and management isn't just inefficient. It is structurally biased by our own biology.
So the solution the sources point to is evidence-based management, using structured interviews, actual data, and rigid systems. Like when classical orchestras realized they had a massive gender bias in hiring,
Right.
they didn't just tell the judges to try to be less biased, because that never works. They physically changed the environment. They started doing blind auditions where the musicians played behind a screen. They used physical blinds to overcome mental blinders.
It's a perfect example of choice architecture in hiring. But fixing the hiring process is just the start. How do you motivate people once they're actually in the door? Traditional management leans heavily on extrinsic motivation, carrots and sticks.
Which I've always been told that bonuses and pay of performance are the ultimate motivators. Are the sources saying we should scrap financial incentives? Because looking at the Dan Ariely data in these sources, it seems like throwing money at complex problems might actually make people perform worse.
It does feel completely counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it makes sense when you look at how extrinsic rewards can actually crowd out intrinsic motivation. Dan Ariely uses a brilliant thought experiment for this. Imagine going to a friend's house for a wonderful dinner party.
Okay.
They cook you a beautiful meal, pour great wine. At the end of the night, you pull out your wallet and offer to pay the host $100 for their trouble.
Oh my gosh, they would be incredibly insulted. You'd probably never be invited back.
Exactly. Because you transmuted a social obligation doing something out of care, pride, and friendship into a cheap economic transaction.
Wow.
And there's a famous real-world example of this too. Daycare centers in Israel had a problem with parents picking up kids late. So the administrators instituted a late fine to penalize the parents. But tardiness actually increased.
Wait, really? The fine made them more late.
Yeah.
Because, oh, I get it. The parents stopped feeling guilty about making the teachers wait. They just saw it as paying for extra babysitting. The fine relieved their moral burden.
Exactly. Money works fine as a motivator for rote, mechanical tasks like assembling widgets on a factory line. But for complex, creative problem-solving work, it actively damages performance.
So what's the alternative?
True performance comes from fostering intrinsic motivation, which rests on 3 pillars: autonomy, mastery, and purpose.
Google's 20% time is a great example of autonomy, where employees get a portion of their week to work on side projects. But, giving people free time is the easy part. How do you implement strict, rigid systems without ruining the culture? Because the Prosy case studies mention PAL's sudden service, and they seem to do exactly that.
Oh, PALS is fascinating. They're a fast food chain that vastly outperforms its massive competitors, and their secret is systemic discipline.
How so?
Well, they do not open a new store just because there is market demand or because a real estate opportunity popped up. They only open a new location when their rigorous internal training system has produced a fully capable manager ready to run it. The internal system dictates the growth, not arbitrary external pressures.
It's the ultimate application of system over impulse. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, motivation is really nothing more than a fleeting chemical calculation in your midbrain.
Right.
It's heavily influenced by how much sleep you got, how stressed you are, and whether your brain predicts a reward. It is a spark, but it is not the fuel.
Exactly. To achieve anything meaningful, whether you are an individual trying to learn a new language or an organization trying to scale, you must abandon the myth of willpower.
You have to migrate your goals from your prefrontal cortex to your basal ganglia by building habits.
Yes. You have to embrace the 2-minute rule to drop your activation energy, and you must construct a choice architecture that makes your success the default option.
So to you, the learner listening right now, here is your mission for today. Do an environmental audit. Look around your home or your workspace. What is one point of friction you can add to a bad habit? And what is one point of friction you can remove from a good habit? Change the environment and the behavior will follow.
And as you do that, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We often view discipline, routines, and strict systems as restrictive. We think of them as things that rob us of our spontaneity and our freedom.
Sure, yeah.
But consider this: if our brains are biologically wired to constantly take the path of least resistance, to conserve energy at all costs, then relying on your raw instincts actually makes you a slave to your environment.
That's a profound way to look at it.
Paradoxically, it is only by designing strict systems and rigid habits that we can put the mundane parts of our lives on autopilot. And by doing that, we free up our prefrontal cortex to experience true creativity, autonomy, and freedom.
Discipline equals freedom. Next time that alarm goes off at 5 a.m. and it's cold and the bed is warm, don't lie there waiting for the lightning bolt. The lightning bolt isn't coming. Roll over, put your feet on the floor, and trust the system.